What I wanted to start with, to give a shout out to this great book by Bill Sweetser, Copious Fountain, and I understand he's doing a workshop on this after lunch, so go to it and enjoy that. When I read this, not being a union person myself, before I was called to this position, I really didn't know that much about union, and so I've been trying to learn as much as I can. And when I read this book, what was really interesting to me, there's lots of interesting things in there, but what I really found interesting was the reason why union was created. In fact, Union and Princeton and Columbia all started at the same time, and they all started for basically the same reason, as I read the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we had a bunch of Presbyterian churches without pastors. And it became prohibitive to send pastors to Scotland to be trained, so we needed to have Presbyterian seminaries here in the United States. But the reason, the reason that drove that, I mean, there's lots of reasons, but the one that stands out for me is we had all these empty pulpits that needed educated clergy people. That sounds like a very Presbyterian reason to start a seminary. So I like to think about this in terms of what is our situation today. So one of the ways, if you're doing analysis or evaluation or assessment, one of the tools is called a condition intervention model. And that just gives you a way to map out what is it that we're trying to solve and how is it that we're trying to solve it. So in the initial creation of Union Seminary, we had churches without pastors. And so the seminary then was the answer, the intervention to fix that problem. Now the question is that still our problem today? Do we still have a bunch of churches without pastors that the seminary is meeting that need? Now, if you've read this article recently in the Outlook, which is based on some research and some presentations that Lee Henson Hasty has made at Next Church and at Big Ten and some other places, he's making the argument that we do, in fact, have coming down the road a crisis of not enough pastors for all of our churches. And that's based on this data. This is not just for Presbyterians. And if you're not a Presbyterian, everything I say won't be just a Presbyterian. But what I do say about Presbyterianism in the PCUSA applies to every mainline denomination. Just the particular numbers may be a little different. But this is a piece of data that covers all pastors in the United States. The median age for pastors in the United States right now is 57. So that means in the next 10 years, many of those pastors are keyed up to retire, although I've noticed Presbyterians are bad at retiring. But we can talk about that'd be a whole nother keynote. This is the data that just for Presbyterians, that more than half of all of our pastors in the PSUSA under age 65 last year will reach age 65 in 10 years. So that's pretty significant. And so the argument goes that as all of those pastors retire, we're going to have a dearth of trained clergy that have come through theological education and are in the call and ordination process. Now, I think that this is really important and worth paying attention to. I'm actually not totally convinced by this argument because I think it doesn't account for two really important things. One, it doesn't account for, and I don't think we have any accounting of the existing grads of theological education that don't have full-time calls. Now, Frank Spencer's here, and actually Board of Pensions has some good ways to sort of track this in terms of how many grads actually go on to become benefit receivers from the Board of Pensions, which indicates that they have a full-time call in a church, an installed position. But I think that still like a total accounting of how many seminary graduates there are that don't have a call, we don't really totally have a sense on. The other thing, which actually I'm more interested in, and which I think is the more challenging argument than the backlog, is how many of these churches that will have pastors retire from them will actually be viable in 10 years. How many will have full-time pastorates still available, or however many of those churches will even still exist. And so to that, I pull up the numbers and sort of the charts that some of you have seen me use in other contexts. This is the decline of our membership for the Presbyterian Church since 1960. So there's less than half as many Presbyterians now as there were 50 years ago. and that's a challenging statistic to pay attention to. Now, one of the things when this and this is the most recent, this is from 2016, where we lost 89,000, almost 90,000 members total, down to a historic low of 1.48 million. So this is 2016. Now, for the last several years, as I've been paying attention to this, I remember when this first sort of hit a really big number of decline was 2012. There was a loss of 102,000, almost 103,000 members. And what I heard from a lot of leaders was, this is just going to be a temporary blip, because this was right on the edge or the heels of a lot of our Book of Order changes, in particular having to do with LGBTQ ordination and also same-gendered marriage, and that once all of this sort of settles out, this won't be so bad. But for what it's worth, in 2013, it was also 90,000. In 2014, it was 92,000. In 2015, it was 95,000. And then 90,000 again in 2016. This doesn't seem like a trend that's changing to me. This seems like a trend that's staying pretty constant. Now, I'm not a statistician. I'm just a simple preacher. But this seems like something worth paying attention to. The other statistic that I think is important, so a lot of people will say, again, a lot of our losses, and we just had in Presbyterian of the James another example of this past Saturday, of churches leaving the denomination to go to a different reform body. So it's true, and I've tracked this every year, so it's true that in 2016, 99 congregations left the PCUSA to go to a different Presbyterian denomination. And it's been around there for all these past several years. This varies from year to year on whether or not this number is higher or lower, but it's always right about the same. And this is what's important to me. We simply closed 97 churches in 2016. Right? So as many churches as leave, we just simply close because they don't have enough members, they can't afford a pastor, they can't afford to stay around. And what I'm especially interested in is, in place of that, we only chartered 17 new churches. Now, to lose 200 and to create 15 is not a sustainable model for sustainability and longevity, right? That's just based on congregations. This is some other data, which I think is, this also has recently come out, that this shows some other things that we've known for a long time, which is that the majority, the chart on the left, if you can read that, the majority, almost 60% of PCUSA churches have less than 50 members. So the majority of our churches have less than 50 members, but that only accounts for, if you look in the right corner on the top, 17% of our members. So what that says is that even though it's the case, and this isn't just Presbyterians, this is every single mainline denomination, and increasingly also evangelical denominations, and I could talk about that some other time. But what this says is that though there are fewer and fewer mainline Christians each year, they're more and more concentrated in the larger churches. Right? And so those smaller churches, again, are struggling in ways that are different. But everyone in this case is really struggling. Now, here again.
John, just real quick, I got to change my road speech. You say over half have less than 50 now. I've been saying less than 100.
Yeah, this just came out last week at the Mid-Councils Conference. I think Frank probably made this. So I'm glad you're here, except I'm actually worried that you're here. This is like preaching. You know, y'all get worried when you preach to your professors. I get worried when I preach to Frank. And earlier I saw Heath Rada here, and I'm kind of glad that he left the room. But if he comes back, he can take me on. All right. This also is from some recent data. This is 2014. This is the last time this data was arranged this way. But out of the 9,790 Presbyterian congregations in 2014, about a third, over 3,000, didn't have pastoral leadership. Okay? Now again, that doesn't sort of break it down by size, but this does. So out of those 9,000, 3,213 in 2014 had less than 50 members. About 1 in 10, just over 1 in 10, that's the blue wedge, had an installed pastor. The green wedge, that's folks that had some other kind of leadership, maybe in our presbytery, in the Presbyterian of the James, we call a covenant pastor, some sort of temporary pastoral, non-installed, generally part-time position. But 1,831 had no pastoral leadership whatsoever. Again, this is a challenge for us to consider. Yes, sir.
And if we need to lay this in, please, but I just got to ask it because it's on my mind. It's something I've been really contemplating for a while since I've become a teaching elder in the Presbyterian church.
Yeah.
But my background is not Presbyterian.
Mine isn't either.
Presbyterian. Considering our commitment to unity, why do we have such a hard time encouraging mergers? Because when you look, based on this statistic, you have...
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Churches, to give you an example, my first call was in Lancaster, South Carolina. Within a 5-mile radius, there were 10 of us.
Right.
Lancaster has 8,000 people at that. We have
Right.
10 Presbyterian churches.
Yeah. Right. So, we're not doing a good job with that. I'm not sure what the magic sauce is to make that happen. What I've heard repeatedly and what I've experienced is those congregations want to maintain their piece of the pie where they are. Sometimes there's more complicating factors, especially in older churches of cemeteries, right? So if you have 5 churches in one rural area that each have 20 members, and they're being served by one pastor, maybe in a 3 or 4 point charge, but they all have a cemetery that's 200 years old. What do you do with that, right? How do you manage that? So some of it, there's some legitimate logistics. Some of it is holding on to a past that we're not willing to let go of, right? And that's a harder conversation to navigate, as many of us know. All right, so this is just this morning. I always look at this, and I use this a lot with our students, again, as, I don't know if it's a wake-up call, but a reality check. I always like to go on the Church Leadership Connection to see what the current state of job openings is, right? So there's currently, today, as of this morning, 2,064 call seekers in our system, and that's for 562 calls or positions. Now, even more, what I think is helpful for seminary students, and as we're thinking about this here, out of those 2,064, only 197 are first-time call seekers, and that's for 119 first calls, or jobs that are open to first-time call seekers. Now, that's actually the best number of the best combination of openings to seekers, of first-time call seekers, that I've seen in the last 2 years that I've been doing with this. My hunch is because all of our recent grads took all of those other first-time call jobs, and so that number went down relative to the other ones. But it is the case that this is, you have not quite a 1 in 2 chance of finding a job in an established church. So I don't think that our problem, the condition with our intervention, is churches without pastors. It's more right to say it's churches that can't afford pastors, right? And so my question is, what in our seminary curriculum currently, or the seminary curriculum or PSCE curriculum that you studied under, prepared you or are currently preparing our students for this condition? Right? What are we teaching? What are we preparing our students with in order to meet this need? Now, I don't think this is the only need. And here again, some of you have seen slides like this that I do on a regular basis. The overall narrative of American religion, and we can't miss this, is the overall decline of Protestantism. So it's not just Presbyterians, it's not just mainline Protestants. Every form of Protestants are smaller now than they used to be. And also along with that, it's the so-called rise of the nones, folks with no religious affiliation. This is the 2014 data which from Pew, which I hope eventually will be updated. I'm sure that it will, and it will show an even higher percentage of unaffiliation. Right here it's about 23%. I'm sure that it's at 25 or higher, and that's only going to go up, and the others are only going to go down. So I would say that the bigger condition and intervention model that we're looking at is churches that can't afford pastors, a rising number of unchurched people in our culture, and a rising number of de-churched people in our culture. And again, my question is, what in our current curriculum, or the curriculum that you studied, prepares our leaders for this reality? And are we designing our seminary and theological education to meet those needs? And what I think, and this is my biggest criticism, this isn't about Union, this is about every seminary that I know, is that we're still primarily training clergy and educators for existing church jobs. Everything about our curriculum and our way of thinking and our mindset is that we are preparing you for a job that exists out there that you're going to go step into and then do really well at. But the problem is those jobs are fewer and fewer. And we have to come up with a different way of training our clergy and educators and also preparing for this future that's unfolding. So we could look at this and say, okay, so if this is the case, why don't we train our clergy and educators to grow our existing churches, to at least make those better and stronger. Now again, here I'm going to give just a quick several slides that some of you have seen before, but if you haven't, here's my provocative statement for the day. Attractional church no longer works. And what I mean by that is that church growth strategies designed to attract members with better worship services and better programs have a limited return on investment now because churches are all essentially competing with each other for a shrinking segment of our population, namely people who like church. So churches that grow, and there are churches that grow, you probably know some in your presbytery or your area or whatever your judicatory is. Churches that grow typically are already the larger, well-resourced churches that already offer the best worship services, the best programs, and they grow at the expense of those other churches that are struggling to survive or are actively dying. And again, we've seen it's because of this. There's fewer number of people that are already inclined to want to buy what we're selling, for lack of a better word, and what we've seen here. There are fewer numbers altogether, and they're being more concentrated in the larger churches. And so the smaller churches just find it next to impossible to compete in that kind of environment. So attractional church no longer works. Let me pause there. Any just come back to that? Or yes?
I attend a church that would be in the larger group, just barely. I attend a church that would be in the larger group, but my feeling is that these numbers are probably worse than what you're seeing, just based on my knowledge of our church roles.
Yeah.
We are a growing church, but we have so many people on our roll listed as active members that are no longer active.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, a corollary of all this that I like to share, I mean, the church that I served before I came to Union is Fourth Church in Chicago, the second largest church in our denomination. And it grew by double, during the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s. So that was a successful church. I ran the youth ministry for 9 years before I came here. I know that most of my families drove past multiple other Presbyterian churches to come to our program. And so I know what that looks like. But I was also, being on the inside of that for 9 years, I saw the cracks on the walls, even at a place like that, right? And every church that I know has those cracks. The churches that are succeeding in that way have a little longer cushion before they realize that what they think has always been working isn't working anymore. But they're going to eventually hit that. In the same way that the Southern Baptist Church, which has been the juggernaut of American religion for so long, is also sort of hitting a wall, right? And so that's going to happen. Yes, sir, in the back.
In my generation of being at PSCE and Union, I went straight from high school to college to seminary.
Right.
They turned me loose in the church when I'm about 25 years old.
Yeah.
Now, it seems to me that your statistics should be encouraging people who've got some other skills and some other life experiences before they even get to seminary, so they have more options about how to use themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And I think that's a question that we think about and wrestle with all the time. And actually, Union has a great dual model that helps us think that through, because the Charlotte platform is largely students that are already working in other jobs. Sometimes they're church jobs, but a lot of times they're not. And I always love picking Richard's brain about this, because he comes up with great examples of students that are doing amazing things and probably won't go into parish ministry. There we go. Yeah, well, there you go. But are using that theological education for a bigger sort of kingdom-oriented goal rather than just a church or ecclesiologically oriented goal. That also would probably be a different talk, right? Now, yeah, since we have some questions, go ahead. Actually, right behind you. She's got the mic. Then you.
I appreciate the question about how our seminary is preparing students for leadership in the church. I'm not sure that that's our major issue. I mean, I think most seminaries do a fine job of preparing students to lead, and I'm more concerned, and it's been my experience and that of my colleagues, that while there's probably a 1 or 2 year gap before somebody runs a really good job in the church, our system no longer supports the pastors that we're producing in the way that it once did. So it's harder to navigate the system because our theology of call doesn't always line up with the reality of what it's like to be a new leader, an emerging leader in our denomination. So no longer, in my case, I was a part-time temporary supply pastor for 7 years. That suited me very well. I had a good relationship with my congregation, but I wasn't installed till a number of years after I started. And our presbyteries and our CLC system are usually not that supportive. And I don't think, I would question the accuracy of the CLC numbers, because both churches and candidates for jobs stay on that system much longer than reality, you know. So
Some do, yeah, but
I don't know. I just
when you say more support, what exactly are you looking for?
more flexibility and a better application of our polity instead of policing. Maybe a creative, responsible use of our polity to help leaders find positions that can support them well.
Like, I guess I'm struggling to understand from your comment, what is a position that would support you well?
A position.
Well, like, what's the reality that you have in mind that's different from our current reality? Because I'll tell you my reality that's different than our current reality. Maybe they're the same, I don't know.
I think that lots of times students come out of seminary and struggle to find positions because they're geographically bound, maybe because they have partners or spouses that can't move. I think the average income for a newly ordained person is like $53,000 that won't support a family, and so that makes it hard for them to want to take some positions that are more rural or support smaller churches that actually could afford a pastor.
Right.
I think that people who are bivocational typically are isolated in their ministry because they can't get to Presbyterian meetings, and the Presbyterian doesn't seek them out to support them. They can't come to continuing education programs like this because they don't have a budget or the time, things like that.
So, right, so what then would the CLC or a presbytery or a seminary, for that matter, do to change that equation, right?
Gather together in a collaborative way and come up with some new, more progressive ways to support pastors and congregations.
Yeah, okay, good. Which I think is where I'm heading with this, right? I mean, this is about entrepreneurial ministry from my perspective. And I think the reality is we've been relying too much on these existing churches and this existing system to create a nice middle-class job that's viable for a seminary grad. And that since there's fewer of those, we haven't come up with an alternative. And this is where I actually think that there is a role for seminaries to play a different sort of training role in that. Because if we're only training, I agree, we do a great job of training people for church jobs, right? Or for existing church jobs. But how much training do we do across the system, not just union, but across the board, in training students to start new churches, or in training students to express their ministry, as you're saying, in very different ways. Typically, when I talk about this, and let me just... yeah, sure, and I'll show you, that's what my next slides are. Here's what I mean by attractional church. Imagine that this circle is the entire membership of your church, okay? Whatever it is, if it's 50, if it's 150, or if it's 5,000. The circle's not up there, so that doesn't mean anything to you. All right, that circle. I know you know what a circle looks like. That circle is your membership. Every church that I know has a core group of active members that participate in everything, that do everything, that are on your leadership. The next sort of ring out from that are folks, and incidentally, the people in the core in most of our churches now are like twice a month participants, right? I mean, like the 3 or 4 times a month is, again, a thing of the past. So the folks in the middle, twice a month, like we're happy for that. The next ring out are folks that I typically think of as being participating in something your church does like 8 to 12 times a year, right? So maybe monthly, maybe a little less. And then the folks on that outer ring then are the once or twice a year, Christmas and Easter or confirmation or Mother's Day folks that are really very peripherally engaged in what you're offering. Now what I mean by attractional church is that, again, most every church that I know, and if your church is the exception, congratulations, you're the exception, spends the vast majority of their time and resources, their pastor's time, their volunteers' time, their money, their budget, on meeting the needs of that core group of people. And they do very little to nothing, I think, of being in meaningful relationship with the folks that are in those next rings, and almost nothing with the people that are outside of the congregation at all, except try to draw them back into the middle, right? So we missed you in church. We missed you in worship. We want you to come back. We missed you in the Bible study. We want you to come back. We missed you in Sunday school. We need you here. It's all trying to say, here we have this one package that we think this is a great way to connect with God, and we want you to be a part of it. The other way of thinking would be to switch that and to be more missional and be more about being in a posture of sentness rather than a posture of establishment and attraction, right? And this is, again, would be a different keynote that I've given multiple times, so I wanted to do something different for y'all. That's all about how to shift our thinking to, instead of being establishment pastors in existing churches, to being what I call post-Christendom missionaries that go out into a variety of different cultural spaces to be church in those spaces. I could certainly talk about that, but that's one thing. The next piece of that, what I wanted to really talk about this morning, is related to that, and often goes hand in hand, is what I would call entrepreneurial ministry, which is to say, can you create something new, right? If there's a limited number of things that are out there, what are you doing to create something new? And that can be in an existing church context. We have lots of needs for newness within our existing churches, or it can be create something completely from scratch. And again, my question is, what is it in our seminary education that is preparing students to do that? And how do we maximize our resources in order to do that? So here's an example. I wanted to have a panel, and unfortunately some of the folks that I wanted to be a part of this couldn't come. But one of them is Nikki McMillan, who is a graduate of this program of our seminary. And she does some other things now, but she had one of the early success stories in the 1001 New Worshiping Community movements of Bear Bulb Coffee, which was they started a coffee shop. Right, so I just want to show this video. Now, just those of you that are cynics, this coffee shop closed, and this didn't have longevity. That's a totally different story that I would love to talk about. And I only know some of those details, but that's really not as pertinent to the point that I'm trying to make. I want you to watch this video of Bear Bulb Coffee and think about what this is as an example of entrepreneurial ministry.
At first glance, you probably wouldn't recognize Bear Bulb Coffee as a typical church, and that's because we're not. Nearly 4 years ago, the leadership of First Presbyterian Church in Warner Robins, Georgia, began to dream about new ways to engage their community. Like most congregations, we wanted to do a better job reaching our youth and young adults. That's when the idea of forming a coffee shop began to take shape. The concept was simple. Let's use a business to drive our mission outside our walls.
I like to come here because the coffee is way better than Starbucks, and I just like the people. It's a lot of fun. It's a place where all of us can hang out.
It's about those micro moments, in the day that, you can touch somebody else's life and they can touch yours.
Our goal has been to create a space where people want to gather. We host a variety of volunteer activities and community events, including the area's largest open mic night.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Real Coffee.
The best thing about working here are the people. You have so many different people that come in just to be able to serve them in any capacity, whether it's serving a cup of coffee, it's talking with them about their life experiences, their stories.
We're not traditional. We're about caring and sharing, and that just means a lot to me. And I feel like that I can make a difference by hanging out up there and meeting people.
Sundays at Bear Bulb Coffee are a time of genuine fellowship and sharing, with scripture and singing, and always open hearts and warm hospitality. Sometimes people ask us when we might form a real church, and more the answer has become that for us, this might just be what church looks like.
Now, how do you teach that at seminary, right? How do you teach how to start up a coffee shop? I don't know that you can, but I think that you can start to teach something about that entrepreneurial spirit and to provide resources on how to connect with other folks. I'm drawn to this partly because, as you heard in the introduction, I'm doing this right now. One of the learning labs and teaching labs that I've set up in Richmond for our students and beyond is a new worshiping community called the Joyful Feast, which is all about gathering. It's like a dinner church sort of model, which there are lots of these around. One of the ways that we're trying to make that sustainable is my wife and I bought a barbecue trailer, and we've set up a barbecue business that we're just about to launch both of these things together. Right, and I wasn't always sure if they would happen together. But I have 3 degrees in religion, theology, and ministry. I had no preparation whatsoever on how to start an LLC, right, or how to think about how to all these things. Now there are people that I can talk to, and that's really helpful. The closest thing I would say that we have to this at Union, and I'm so thankful for it, and I actually, as a professor, audited this class, is Ken McFadden's business administration class, which most seminaries I don't think do offer something quite comparable. I certainly didn't have that. And what's beautiful about that is not only is it offered as a course for students, for new grads, it's offered as a series of seminars, or maybe it's a 1 week, I don't know exactly how that works. But we provide a lot of those. 6 times a year, okay. So we provide a lot of those skills that actually a lot of folks don't have. And so I had lapped that up. That was really meaningful for me, right? So how do we prepare students for something like that that's really outside of the existing church box? Here's another example, also one of our alums, Edwin Lacey, who has a really cool new worshiping community called the Wild Goose Community out in a very rural part of Western Virginia. I visited there with a group of students this last year and just was blown away by a lot of what they do. But I want to just show this to you because, again, here's one of our alums who was able to do something that I would say is really entrepreneurial by taking a church that wasn't dying but had already died and was sitting there empty, and say, what if we could breathe something new into that? So if you're not familiar with Wild Goose, watch this.
A little country church on the road to nowhere. Literally, the church was built in horse and buggy days and was no longer on the way to anywhere. It was standing at death's door. So the Presbyterian locked it, put the for sale sign up, and let the fire die out. But if there's one thing God's good at, resurrecting the dead. Out of the ashes, Wild Goose took flight as part of the 1001 New Worshiping Communities Initiative.
For the Presbyterian, the old congregation had lived out its life. It had come to an end. And so this was an opportunity in Wild Goose to do something new and fresh, a resurrection moment in Appalachian culture at this time.
Churched and unchurched alike are drawn to our casual Tuesday evening worship services. We call them uprisings.
I love that so many different types of people have come together to form this brand new awesome community.
I haven't been into church in the last 30 years to speak of, and I've really missed the night since I've been coming here.
In an atmosphere of authentic Christian community, our Wild Goose family celebrates God in the context of local culture.
One of the main things here is the good food and the good fellowship.
I just love Wild Goose and where we have the old hymns played through brass music.
Rocking chairs, bluegrass music, square dancing, potluck suppers, we do it all. As we gather to worship Jesus and experience the beauty of God's creation.
The church and the community. You don't find this everywhere. It's a great connection.
Wild Goose, a country church, sharing the good news of Jesus with those on the road to somewhere outside traditional church.
My favorite line of that is always like rocking chairs, potlucks, and bluegrass. We do it all, and square dancing. We do it all. That's all you need, right? Now, the couple things that I love about that example. Edwin is not one of those under 40 pastors, if you didn't notice, right? So this isn't an age restrictive thing. This is a guy who was an associate pastor at an established church who saw this opportunity and convinced his presbytery, let me try something new because I have a passion for bluegrass music. And I think that I could tap into a subculture of people in this rural community who don't want anything to do with normal church, and say by doing bluegrass music as our hook, we can gather a community, and they did. Now, what's also interesting about that example is that they don't have any intention of becoming a chartered church, right? That is, by design now, a mission of their presbytery to that community. So again, like back to this question of what can we do to think differently? Like, what if we actually thought as a missionary church again, that it's enough for us to invest in this community without expecting the return on investment of them being a part of this presbytery in the way that we typically think about it. That to me is, again, a really amazing and helpful idea. So what is it that you sort of can cultivate within students or within yourselves or with existing people to say, I have a passion and I want to pursue it, right? Edwin's was bluegrass music, mine's barbecue, and what is yours, right? That's how to follow that. I want to give you one more example. This is not one of our alums. This is a friend of mine in Chicago named Adam Walker Cleveland, who some of you may know. Or if you don't, you maybe know his product that he sells now called Illustrated Children's Ministry. So Adam was in between calls, finding himself sort of struggling to find the next church, but he had cultivated actually through a presbytery grant. So the Presbytery of Chicago got like $10,000 or $12,000 from their synod and said, we're just going to give these out as $1,000 grants to pastors to explore some sort of passion or interest. Right, so I got one and I joined a CrossFit gym and lifted heavy weights, and he got one and learned how to draw. And with that thing that he learned, he figured out a way to extend his ministry, not as a called and installed pastor. That's actually incredible. And so if you're not familiar, check this out, because I think this is really cool.
Really, at the beginning, the posters were created for children. Very quickly, we found out that it was not just the kids who wanted to color the posters.
First, I definitely thought, oh, this is just going to be for the little kids and maybe for their parents. We had, sure, a bunch of little kids, but then a bunch of like our seniors and elders coming too. And it was great to see them interact.
It's really hard to sit down and just ask the kids, so what do you think about this? And we can see what their response is. The opportunities that you get to have to actually get kids to talk to you while they're coloring is unlike any other program that churches might offer.
I liked it because you get to like interact with other people and also like relaxing with coloring. And
you know, some of my parishioners would never attend a traditional Sunday school, and so this was the perfect way of getting them to attend an event that was maybe not structured so much, and they weren't intimidated by it.
Rather than a kid just sitting on the floor listening to somebody read a story to them, they get to be involved in the process of seeing the story sort of come alive. Because it does have that intergenerational communal component to it, there are so many different ways to use the posters. Churches will have kids color the posters during Sunday school. Some churches will lay the posters out in the front or the back of the sanctuary during worship, and kids will color during worship, and some adults will come over as well, because that just helps them stay focused during worship a little bit better. We have youth groups that will take these posters and color them, college groups who've used them. I'm sitting here in Skokie, Illinois, drawing on my iPad, knowing that there are going to be people in Australia, and New Zealand, and South Africa, and Canada, and Europe, and Greenland. There's a church in Abu Dhabi who uses our stuff. We're really offering something to communities that's new and that's different.
You have your old people and your young people, your introverts and your extroverts, and people who you just never think would even come and color together, and there they are at the table.
So the whole thing started for Adam with the experience that maybe some of you share of like not liking to do children's talks because they're hard to come up with something to do. And so he said, what if I created these little cards, these like really simple pictures that would illustrate the story of that day that we're going to share with the children in the children's talk. And so from that, then when he had the opportunity being between calls, he's created this like really incredible global ministry that reaches out and employs a lot of other people besides himself, right? Now, he didn't know how to start a business, right? He just sort of fumbled into this and had to learn it on the fly. Is there a way that a seminary could have helped prepare him for that, either as part of its curriculum, right? What if he had a class on how to start a small business that was maybe done in conjunction with the local business school? What if he had some sort of workshop that helped him with that? Or what if there was like a certificate program for graduates that could come back and gather together people to help you even workshop ideas like that and to bring them out into a finished form, right? Or what if there was a D-Min program in Entrepreneurial Ministry? I don't know what all the possibilities are, but are there ways that we can help work with students and grads and alums and people out there to do that kind of thing to make a difference? Now, one of the books that, yes ma'am.
I'd like to answer your question.
Sure.
This is another perspective on the loss of members that we have and the difficulty of trying to draw in new members, the challenge that is. I served on 2 Presbyterian staffs as associate exec. One was in the north, Michigan, the other in Virginia. And part of my responsibility was to get out and to get to know the churches. That we couldn't serve the churches unless we were out there.
Right.
And so I spent Sundays traveling throughout both of these presbyteries and getting acquainted. I can tell you, and it almost brings tears to my eyes, how inhospitable we are as Presbyterians.
Sure. Yeah.
I've been told I have to move out of a pew because somebody is sitting in it. Really.
Right.
I asked to sit down on a couch where there was a vacant spot. They said, no, I'm saving that for my friend. I currently am visiting a church in Virginia because I'm new in the area. I've been there 3 Sundays. The first Sunday, one person greeted me and took me around and introduced me. The second Sunday, somebody that was sitting in front of me spoke to me. The third Sunday, no one spoke to me. Even when we passed the peace, people in front of me didn't even turn around.
Yeah.
I turned around to the people behind me, but they didn't.
Right.
I mean, I could go on and on, but the stories are tragic. It's really sad how fearful we are of new people, and how uncomfortable is the description.
Absolutely.
And sometimes pastors would not, well, most of the time the pastor knew I was coming, but the congregation did not. And occasionally the pastor wanted to know how friendly the church was to me. Because the people tell him they're very friendly. They talk to each other so comfortably. They're very friendly people.
Sometimes they don't even do that though. So yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Yes, ma'am.
Really serious.
Yeah, no, for sure. That would be a different talk and a different workshop. So yeah.
It fits into what the students would learn about what's necessary.
Absolutely. No, absolutely.
So thank you.
Absolutely. Now, a book that I've used, and a thinker in general that I've used in my work in evangelism, and it's outside of the church realm altogether, is Seth Godin, who is one of the leading marketing gurus and has really earned his reputation as helping to move thinking in the advertising and marketing world away from the kind of older model of kind of one-size-fits-all billboard or magazine advertising, what he would talk about as intrusive advertising, into a different way of advertising that he calls invitational advertising, when you actually get people to want to know what it is that you're selling. Now, again, I'm not trying to reduce evangelism to marketing. And I don't think that's, don't hear me doing that, but it's helpful, I think, to step outside of our own circles to say, how are people in other fields? Because the challenges that we face as a church aren't just our challenges, right? This is about our culture changing in radically ways across the board. If we had more time, we could unpack some of that. What I like about Seth is that he has sort of seen some of the same challenges in the advertising and marketing world and is coming up with a different way of thinking about it. And this book, Tribes, is one that I've used in a couple of classes. I want to show you a video here. This will be the last video. That is him sort of talking about it, and it's an animated version of a talk that he gave that picks out some of the central arguments from Tribes, but then I'll go through it as well. And I want you to sort of imagine that he's talking about the church instead of an ad agency or a company that's trying to sell its product, right? So imagine that he's talking about the church, and I think you'll see a lot of resonance in what he's saying.
Organizations that want to do marketing used to do marketing by interrupting people. They used to do it by yelling at people who didn't want to hear from them about stuff they didn't want to hear about. And they figured if they just yelled at enough people often enough, they'd make enough money to earn it back. Small businesses wrestle with this because small businesses don't have enough money to yell at them. Well, the world hasn't changed. We have discovered that people don't pay attention to ads, hit the ads, and respond to the ads, and remember the ads. But what the internet is making it easier to follow people you want to follow, to connect to people you want to connect to. So the future of marketing, it turns out, is leadership. And if you do something that people want to follow, if you connect people to people they want to be connected to, they'll join a tribe, a group of people interested in accomplishing something. And if you can lead a tribe, then the marketing will take care of itself. Small businesses have a lot of advantages. The biggest one is they're run by human beings, whereas big businesses are often run by committees. People don't want to follow a committee. They want to follow a person. And you must be genuine and authentic in order to connect these people. The beauty for small companies is that tribes don't have to be very big to be effective. You have 1,000 true fans. 1,000 people will drive across the country to see you perform. 1,000 people will tell their friends. That's enough to make an impact. The other thing you need to do is figure out that not everyone wants to be in your tribe. And one of the most difficult things to do as a small business person is say, you're not in, you're not in, you can't do this. Because we want everyone to be our customer. But tribes, all of them, succeed because there's outsiders. You can't have insiders if you don't have outsiders. For example, let's say you're a plumbing supply house. Why not invite all the plumbers, the ones who never get to talk to each other over a meal, together once a month to a party, just to talk to other plumbers? Now, you don't have to say, talk about my widgets or talk about my faucets. Just talk. Now, if all the plumbers come together once a month to meet each other and trade stories and hang out, don't you think they're going to want you to be part of that conversation? Don't you think you become irreplaceable in the extent that you are the host of all these plumbers? Instead of saying, I have the cheapest faucets, what you need to say is, I have the coolest plumbers. Come here, you get invited to the other to meet your peers. So there's all these opportunities to unlock conversation, but no one is going to talk about your boring products and boring people. If that's what you insist on, then be prepared to deal with it. And so I guess the real question that I'm asking is, if you went out of business, who would miss you? The idea of being missed, of being an important part of someone's day, isn't easy to accomplish. And you're not going to accomplish it just by making what the big companies make by a couple of minutes cheaper. You're going to accomplish it because you touch people, because you're generous, because you make change, because there's something about what you do and how you do it that people viscerally connect with. And if you can't do that, then you're going to be struggling for years. If you can do it, you're going to discover there's a line out the door. There's a line of people who want to be touched by you, who want to be connected. If you went out of business, who would miss you?
How many times have you heard that about the church, right? If your church were to cease to exist, who would notice? Who would care besides the people sitting in your pews, right? So Godin talks about a tribe as a group of people connected to one another, connected to a leader, and connected to an idea. A group needs only two things to be a tribe: a shared interest and a way to communicate. He says the goal of marketing, which he understands as storytelling, is change. Rather than selling products, Godin talks about creating movements. See, this sounds a lot like church to me. The movement happens when people talk to one another, when ideas spread within the community, and most of all, when peer support leads people to do what they always knew was the right thing. What really shapes tribes is the sideways communication among the tribe members. Tribes are about connection. Great leaders create movements by empowering the tribe to communicate. This sounds like Presbyterianism to me. They established a foundation for people to make connections as opposed to commanding people to follow them. It's critical for leaders to work on tightening the tribe. A tribe that communicates more quickly with alacrity and emotion is a tribe that thrives. A tighter tribe is one that is more likely to hear its leader, more likely still to coordinate action and ideas across the members of the tribe. So within that tribe, micro-leadership by the members is essential. And he lays out 5 steps and 6 principles. I know I'm blowing through this, but I want to make sure we have time for discussion. These are his 6 steps. Publish a manifesto and give it away for free. Make it easy for followers to connect with you. Make it easy for your followers to connect with one another. Realize that money is not the point of a movement, and track your progress. Here's the principles. Transparency is your only option. Your movement needs to be bigger than you. Movements that grow thrive. Movements that are made most clear when compared to the status quo, or to movements that work to push the other, or to movements that work to push the other direction. Doesn't make sense. I think I missed a word there. Exclude outsiders. Now this, every time I use this, rightly in a Christian seminary context, someone says, this doesn't sound like the gospel or like the kingdom of God. And I agree. I think there's a way to tweak what he means by that, as you saw it in the video, to say is that we can't be all things to all people. Right? And there's a way for us to enact that in our entrepreneurial ministry. But finally, tearing others down is never as helpful to a movement as building your followers up. So here's what I do when I assign this book to my students, and I have them read it. And I have them write an essay, and then we talk about this. Based on your reading of Godin and other stuff that we're doing, what does spiritual leadership look like in a post-Christendom environment of fewer congregations, shrinking memberships, and limited jobs in established churches? This connects back to the question that I asked you at the very beginning. Why did you come to seminary or to PSCE? Right? If you came to one of those places because you wanted to only serve in an established church, that's not a good reason to go anymore. Right? Because you're not guaranteed to get one of those jobs. But my hope is that what stirs within us as we feel that call to go to receive theological education is we're called to something bigger than that. We're called to some sort of bigger notion of service, some sort of bigger notion of kingdom building, and that there's not just one way that we're going to express that. Right? That we are going to learn and see, have our minds opened to a variety of different possibilities of how, with the gifts that God has given us, we can lead, we can create movements, we can initiate change, which is very much, again, what I think Jesus was about, creating a movement about the emergence of God's kingdom. Now, the last thing, and this sort of, I think, gets to that question of outsiders or insiders or different ways of doing this. Imagine that you're in a community of 6 churches, right? Your community has 6 churches. Now imagine that a new family moves into your community. How do they decide which church to go to? Right? What is it that drives their decision to go to your church or to some other church? Now, I just have recently, in the last 2.5 years, experienced that for the first time as an adult, because prior to moving to Richmond, I've been working in churches for 15 years. I moved to college, or went from college straight to seminary and started working in churches and never stopped. And then I got married and had 2 children. And so when we moved to Richmond, it was the first time ever I had said, how am I going to pick a church for my family? And so I started to think about this in a new way, a way that even as just a 15-year-old pastor, a pastor with 15 years of experience, I had already forgotten how much harder is it, and this sort of gets to your point, ma'am, like those pastors that are in churches that are not friendly to the folks that come in, they've completely forgotten how hard it is to walk into a strange place with people you don't know and say, I want to be a part of this, right? And so to just take the simple, like take a week off, let your session, or encourage, if you're on a session, encourage the session to let your pastor have a week off to just go visit another church and feel how awkward it is, right? Just to experience that. But really, like, how do you choose if you have 6 churches to choose from? How do you pick? What's going to be your choice? Like, what are you basing that on? What's that? Where your friends go? Okay. If they have a good website, yes. Yeah, I'm not even going to walk in a church with a bad website. I'm sorry. What's that? Youth and children's program, right? Okay.
How good the preacher is.
How good the preacher is, yeah. What's that? Mission, like what they're doing. Okay, good. Music, okay. Now, tellingly, not a single person has said, I go to the First Presbyterian Church, right? Or I go to the First Methodist Church because that's my background, right? That's hardly anyone's sort of determining factor anymore. Sometimes that's the case. And I went to Presbyterian churches when we moved to Richmond. But that's not really the main reason. And even if it was, like, let's imagine that each one of these is a church of a different denomination, right? From an outsider's perspective, how much really is differentiating between each of those? Practically nothing. And so I like to think about it, if you think about this, as soda, right? Now, if you have a strong passion about Coke versus Pepsi, and I suspect many of you do, you would not agree that they're essentially the same. No, we're not going to get passionate about anything else except this. Same thing, like Dr. Pepper and Mr. Pibb, I tell my kids they're the same, like when they don't have Dr. Pepper, but you know they're not the same, right? They're nowhere close. And same thing, Sprite and Sierra Mist. But if you don't drink soda, this is all exactly the same. This is just fizzy sugar water. And that's the challenge that we're facing. There's fewer and fewer people in our culture that drink carbonated sugar water. In the same way that there's fewer and fewer people that are interested in going to church. So from the outsider's perspective, these are all exactly the same. Exactly the same. And they're not interested in any of those. And another way to think about it is if you think about like Coke, Pepsi, and RC. Poor RC. Like these are all colas. These are all in the same genre. Again, we know that they're all radically different, right? And we know that one's better. Right? Now, which one has the least market share? RC. That's like the Presbyterian Church of soda, right? Just FYI, we have like around like a 2 to 4% market share of the U.S. population, right? That's like really small. If you think about all the people in the U.S., only about 2 or 3% of them are into what we're doing, right? Now, can RC ever become Coca-Cola? Never. Right? They can be the best RC they can be, and they can try to do what they're doing as RC, but they're never going to be Coke. And I think when we think about churches, we should probably mind that as well. Now, I listened to a couple podcasts on my drive out here about New Coke to remind myself about that. That's an interesting sort of example of trying to change your brand that didn't work, but also it did work. And maybe that'd be a different discussion. But here's what I really want to get to. Coca-Cola knows that there are fewer and fewer people, no matter how superior their product is to Pepsi and RC, that there are fewer and fewer people that are drinking that stuff at all. And they know that if they're going to survive and be meaningful and relevant in the world, they've got to offer more than just classic Coke, right? That's why they tried New Coke. It totally failed. But it didn't fail because it drove up sales of classic Coke. But that's the reason that they have Diet Coke. That's the reason that they sell bottled water. That's the reason that they sell Powerade and a whole bunch of other products that I could put up here, but I didn't. They've diversified their portfolio. They've diversified what they offer. Now, in a cynical way, again, looking at this, the purpose of Coke, or the purpose of the Coca-Cola Company, is to make money, right? Just bracket that for a minute. What this is really about is quenching thirst, right? And that's actually kind of a Christian-y thing to do. Right? There's a whole bunch of good parables and sayings from Jesus about quenching thirst. That's what this is about. And so Coke knows that if they want to succeed in their mission of quenching thirst, they've got to offer more than just Coca-Cola Classic, because fewer and fewer people are going to drink that. And I think it's the same way for us, right? The one traditional way that most of us do whatever mainline tradition you're from, if you only do that over and over and over, it's like we're just banking everything on Coke Classic. And that's only going to go so far. But if we can find other ways of quenching thirst, which I think is our mission, in slightly different forms, we can create some different opportunities. So just one last thing, and then I'll stop and we'll have some conversation. So when I put this up and talk about going out, people, and I'm doing a practicum with pastors from our Presbyterian right now, where I'm doing a lot of the same stuff. And one of the things that I keep hearing back, and I hear this back all the time, is, isn't drawing people into that middle, isn't that what we're supposed to do? I can't get my mind around not doing that, because what's in there is good, right? And I'm not saying it's not good, but what's in there is good. Don't we want to bring people into that? Why is this bad? And I finally sort of had an epiphany. It's like, it's not bad, but the new way of looking at this is that there needs to be more than one center. Right? That imagine that if there are a variety of different hubs, a variety of different gathering places, a variety of different brands of Coke, Diet Coke, Dasani, and Powerade, and whatever else, that we are able to see that are very traditional, but also very entrepreneurial and different. And traditional and entrepreneurial aren't opposites, right? We need to be entrepreneurial in our traditional places as well. But what if this was our vision of what moving forward into this new world as entrepreneurial ministry could be? And not only that, what if those continued to multiply even out from there, and we started to see a completely different way? I think that's that model of gathering a tribe and creating a movement. And how can we, again, encourage our students and our alums and all those that we serve to be part of that kind of ministry? All right, let me pause. It's 11:35. I think we have till 11:45. Is that right? So we have about 10 minutes for questions. Now here comes Frank. Uh-oh.
Well, I'd like to build on that last point, because I think I want to offer both a hopeful message and I think a caution as well. The idea of moving entrepreneurship into all areas of the church, I think, is what should be the focus. The idea, I think we do our seminarians a disservice if we say the only jobs out there are the ones you're going to create for yourself.
No, I'm not saying that.
I know you're not, but that narrative comes through a lot. I heard that a lot as a union seminarian, that there are no traditional jobs out there. And that's actually not the case. So right now there are 648 inquirers and candidates in our denomination. Last year we ordained right around 200. 62% of those we ordained are in their 20s and 30s. That compares with an average age of ordination in the Episcopal Church of age 50. So we are still continuing, and so I think it's a both and.
Absolutely.
If you look at the last 5 years of 1,001 worshiping communities, there are fewer than 400. So that, if you equate those to jobs, and they're not even jobs,
right.
That's 70 to 80 a year, maybe.
Right.
And yet we're ordaining into more traditional roles 200 a year.
Right.
And so I think it's always a both and.
Right.
The traditional church, as we think of an installed pastor, a sanctuary, and a budget that is more or less balanced, is not going away. And our projections at the Board of Pensions suggest that we as a denomination will bottom out between $1.1 million and $1.2 million in the next 10 years, and then potentially even begin to grow again. So I just want to give that word of hope that we are actually bringing young people through in a very positive way, and most of them are going into those jobs not into coffee shop jobs. And so I just want to have that word of caution that we not fall into a trap of saying everybody's got to be a tent maker.
But I mean, if I understand the numbers that you just gave, I mean, only a third of them are going into jobs, right? You said out of 600, 200 are ordained and going into jobs, right?
Right. So if it takes an average of 4 years to get through the process from inquirer to ordained, we don't have enough to ordain 200 a year. We need more. We need more traditional candidates.
Yeah, I still am
having
trouble with that.
So there's 648 from in the
Right.
process from
Right.
inquirer.
Right.
To
I
get
see.
to
I
be
see what you're saying.
ordained.
Right.
If it takes an average of
Right.
4
Okay.
years,
Right.
we need 800 just
Right.
to stay at a 200 a year pace.
I see. Okay. Right. Right. And I'm not suggesting, you know, I think you're absolutely right. This is a both and, right? I think my point is we've been too one-sidedly focused on the traditional, and we need to encourage the other to go hand in hand. I know that the others are going to continue, but at a diminished rate, right, than what it's been. I mean, there are categorically fewer jobs than there were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. There's categorically fewer churches. Sure, which is maybe okay.